Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining the EMS Academy. For those who I haven't met, my name is Sean Barinholtz. I am an anesthesia and ICU physician at Hopkins. I'm an active member of Pikesville Volunteer Fire Company in Baltimore County, and I have the honor of serving as one of the associate medical directors for Baltimore County Fire Department. On behalf of the EMS, the Medical Director's Office, on behalf of the EMS Office, Chief Nats, EMS Training Academy staff, and Captain Lenny Stewart, thank you guys. Thank you for what you do every day. Thank you for your dedication to lifelong learning. Later in this training, we will send a link. I will send a link out in the chat. If you want your CEUs, click on that link, fill out some information, and you can get your MIM CEUs. If you have any questions about your MIM CEUs, past certificates, or any problems with the sign-in link, please hang out with us after the training, and we will be happy to help answer your questions. So tonight, super excited to have with us Dr. Gamaliel D. Dr. Baer is a professional firefighter, EMT, special operator for Howard County Fire and Rescue. He serves as the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation State Lead Advocate for Maryland and is a NFFF Fellow. He also serves as an intelligence officer for the U.S. Coast Guard and is currently on active duty orders on loan to the Pentagon. Dr. Baer is the author of Operational Intelligence for Health, Wellness, and Leadership, which will be published this year by Fire Engineering. He earned a BS from the University of Maryland, College Park, an MS from Johns Hopkins, and a doctorate of education from the University of Southern California. Dr. Baer, thank you so much for being with us. We super appreciate you.
Thanks, Sean. And please call me G. Anyone who has any comments, questions, or concerns, we can drop the formalities for this experience that we're going to have. Also, just for some housekeeping before we move forward with the presentation, Sean is going to be keeping tabs on any comments or questions, and we've sort of decided that for today, as the questions come up, we'll stop and address the question or comment and then move forward after that. So you don't have to wait to the end. If you have a comment, just feel free to type away in the chat. On my screen, I'm not going to see it, so I'm going to hope and wait for Sean to interrupt me when something comes up. So with that being said, thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and move forward with the presentation. I will say that first of all, I'm honored to be here, and so thank you, Sean. The book project that I worked on is for the NFFF, the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, and all of the royalties from that book are going to be going to the NFFF. So what I'm going to be teaching from today is the material from the book. It hasn't been published yet, but this is going to be chapter 1 essentially from the book. And again, it's not a self-promotion thing. I won't be making a dime from any of the book proceeds, but basically this is an opportunity for you to get some of the material from the book for free. And I'm happy to share that hopefully when the book comes out this summer or early fall, it will be available and all the proceeds will help the NFFF. So without further ado, we're going to move forward with the resilience presentation. This presentation is going to focus on definitions and trying to drill deeper into what resilience really is. And so I put this quote up from Socrates because I think it rings true here. It says, "The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms." A little bit of my background, as Sean pointed out, Howard County Firefighter, Coast Guard, National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. It's a picture of my family. We live in Howard County, Maryland. I'm proud to be a Howard County firefighter. We live in Ellicott City. So it's my wife, Nan, and we have 4 kids. I'm also a certified health coach and certified personal trainer through ACE, and I have my chief training officer credential through CPSC. All right, so we're going to start with looking at what the difference is between health and wellness. And there's a quote up here that you are probably familiar with, but if not, I'll read it for those who've never seen it before. It says, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit." And that quote is oftentimes attributed to Aristotle, but it's actually a paraphrasing of Aristotle. And the paraphrase comes from a guy named William Durant. And what this quote gets to the heart of when you break it down, it really says that the present condition is the result of your actions or our actions. That's what it means to say we are what we repeatedly do. The portion of the sentence that says excellence then is not an act but a habit means that excellence comes from repeatedly choosing the right behaviors over time. So when we look at health, if you look at the definition of human in the dictionary, and I'm using Merriam-Webster here, you get these sort of funny definitions of or relating to humans. You also see that humans are a bipedal primate, and for this specific situation, those definitions don't really help us. But when you look at the definition of health in Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says that health is a condition of being sound in body, mind, or spirit. And so for the purposes of this chapter, I'm going to use that model, the body, mind, soul triad, but feel free to replace that with biopsychosocial if that's what you prefer. That's the more scientific approach, but it still consists of a triad of these different dimensions of the human. And what you get when you mix what Aristotle is saying and what the definition of a human is, these three areas of body, mind, soul, which is the way I'm going to approach that from here on out. But again, feel free to think of it as biopsychosocial. You have this idea that health is actually a snapshot of your body, mind, and soul, which is the result of your wellness efforts. And that's important to distinguish because health and wellness are often used interchangeably and they're often used together, especially in the fire service, but they're not the same thing. Health essentially is the output, wellness is the input. So we're going to talk about now differentiating resilience in objects and humans. Oh, that's strange. I guess you can't see the links here. Sean will have this PowerPoint, and you all are free to have it if you want it later. But there should be some links here. I guess they're getting blown out in the contrast or something like that. They're supposed to be blue, but in any case, the three common definitions.
Should we try to pause and get them, or what are your thoughts on that?
They're here. I can see that the finger over the links are bringing them up, but they're just not showing on the screen. That's fine. No one needs to see the blue hyperlinks for right now.
Okay.
But what's stated in red are the three common definitions of resilience. So if you've heard of resilience before, you may have been told that resilience is the ability to bounce back. You may have heard that resilience is this idea of having reserves. And you may have heard that resilience is the ability to overcome a challenge. So we're going to look at all three of those different definitions and sort of examine those and how those relate to both objects and humans. So in Webster's dictionary, resilience as a noun says it's the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation caused especially by compressive stress. And you can see I put a red box around that. The definition just under that with a green box around it says it's an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. And so you can see I sort of put this in here tongue in cheek. The definition of insanity, or at least the commonly used sort of phrase, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And when it comes to the idea of bouncing back, if resilience is just bouncing back, then what that means is if we are getting physically hit. Let's say you're in the boxing ring and you're boxing somebody like Mike Tyson, and he punches you and you get up. You've heard this phrase, oh, resilience is getting hit 7 times and getting up an 8th time. Well, in certain situations, that could be something that leads to your permanent injury or death. And so there's a problem with this idea that resilience should stop at us defining it as the ability to bounce back. Because if it's something that's stronger than what you're capable of taking, bouncing back may stop happening pretty quickly. There's this other concept of reserves as resilience. And the reason I show you these images is just to show you that this is being studied in journals by very smart people who are looking at this concept of being able to have this reserves inside of you, whether it's mental reserves, or they call it cognitive reserves, or whether it's the ability to cope with stress. And the idea behind reserves is that you have built up a little extra of something, and that, or maybe a lot of extra of something. And this extra gets called into play when you are being taxed or when you are being strained in some way. And the problem with looking at reserves as the only definition of resilience is that it would lead to the logical conclusion that if reserves is what makes you resilient, then having more of everything is going to make us more resilient. But we know that being obese, having more fat, doesn't make us more resilient. In fact, there's research to suggest that it's just the opposite. Becoming, a prepper and filling your entire basement with canned foods is not going to make you as a person more resilient, although it may help you in certain situations. More money may help you in certain situations. More muscles may help you in certain situations. But having more of everything isn't what makes people resilient. And I think we as humans know, we understand that. There may be specific situations where having more of something helps you, but that's in general not going to make you more resilient. In fact, some of the most resilient people that you may know probably don't have a ton of everything. They're probably not the richest person. They're probably not the most muscular person. There's something else there. And so this last concept of resilience is the ability of overcoming some challenge or adapting. And you can see here at the top right of the screen, the Webster's dictionary says that the definition of adjust is to adapt or conform oneself as to new conditions. And that word adapt was in the definition for resilience in Webster's dictionary. That's why I highlighted that. So what you have here is this third definition, which is saying it's about adapting to something. They do use the term bouncing back here, but that doesn't really get us forward. That goes back to the first definition. So we're focusing on this third portion, which is adapting or overcoming a challenge. And if you look at the Harvard Business Review article here at the bottom of the page, not that this should be taken as empirical evidence. This is basically consensus, which is considered maybe the weakest form of truth. But it does suggest that some of the folks that they looked at, they polled these people, 835 employees from different parts of I guess the UK, and they felt that resilience was defined most by the ability to recover from setbacks and adapt to change. So what that means is that in order to overcome a challenge, we can look at this from a few different ways. You can overcome a challenge by experimentation. And if you think of it like Darwinism, then essentially you either adapt to your environment or you die. But the problem with that model is that that can take a very long time. And it means that you're going to have many different people sort of reinventing the wheel on their own. And that's not the most efficient way to overcome a challenge. It may be a very good way to learn, And it may be fun to experiment, but I would say that there's better ways. The two other better ways you can look at overcoming a challenge would be observing somebody, like following a role model, or seeing what success looks like and following that, or conversely, seeing what failure looks like and trying to avoid that. And the last is education, which is learning new information. And you don't necessarily have to observe, but you can observe to learn new information. And essentially what you have here, experimentation, observation, and education, those are essentially the three different ways that that you can acquire knowledge and therefore change. So the argument here goes that if resilience must include the ability to overcome a challenge, and if overcoming a challenge requires change, then in regards to humans, change must occur in at least one of our human dimensions, which we talked about earlier. So when you look at resilience, the point in sharing all this with you is that, yes, there is this concept of bouncing back or regaining shape, but generally that's in regards to static objects or things that can't change. Think of steel, for instance. Steel as a body just remains the same for a very, very long time. It can eventually rust, that's true. And in heat or cold, it may change slightly, but essentially you have little or no changes in a static object. So resilience then in that object just becomes whether or not it can withstand a force that's put on it, like a hammer or something like that. But that's not true with humans, because humans can go through substantial changes for better or for worse. They can become stronger or weaker. And not only that, humans have these three different dimensions: the body, the mind, and the soul. And any one of those dimensions can change for the better or for the worse. And certainly two or all three can change in concert or subsequently, but that is a major difference than a static object. So in that sense, when we talk about humans, resilience is really whether you can overcome a challenge to your whole body, which includes physical, mental, and this sort of spiritual or social ability that humans have. So with that, we're going to go into a theoretical formula for resilience in humans. And essentially, this is what it would look like if you were to put it on paper and try to address this as a math equation. What you have is resilience would equal essentially the product of your body, mind, and soul divided by the challenge that you are facing. You could also just parse that out. So it could be your body over the challenge that is physical, the mind over the challenge that is mental, or the soul that is over the challenge that is spiritual, if you will, or social. And what that says is that if you're faced with a challenge that is stronger or that has more substance than your body, your mind, or your soul can handle, you will probably be defeated in that. Now, of course, humans are very sort of sturdy by nature or resilient by nature, but the idea here is that you can strengthen your body, you can strengthen your mind, and you can strengthen your soul to meet new challenges, especially if it's a challenge that you don't believe you would overcome initially, or if there's one that you have been, defeated by before and you're trying to overcome it going forward. And that brings us to this sort of concept, and I'm using firefighters here in this slide, but you can use EMTs if you're an EMS provider or EMS clinician, as we say now. But the idea is this: if by default we say that the general population has average stress and that the general population on average does an average amount of wellness, then we'll put those in the middle, as you can see on the graph. But what the research literature says about firefighters and EMTs is that we actually do a worse job of wellness efforts, and we're more stressful. And that's not anything that's really disputed in the literature, at least. And so what you have here is you have this wellness deficit from firefighters and EMTs that are more stressed on their day-to-day jobs than the average American by definition. And they're also doing less wellness efforts, which again is the input. And that is causing potentially, but from what I can tell in the literature, a lot of these lifestyle issues that pertain to our resilience as humans. So that could be physical, it could be mental, and it can be social, emotional, spiritual, whatever you want to call it. But essentially, if we're not putting in the effort to grow those areas, our body, mind, or soul, then because we're faced with more stress, we're going to be worse off than the general population, the average of the general population. And it just so happens that the fire service and EMS service, we are, of course, pounding our fists on the table about heart attack, cancer, and suicide, and we're asking for money for that, and we're trying to provide more support for that. And certainly some of that is stress that is unavoidable from work. But what I have found in my research, both for my dissertation and the book, is that there is a substantial amount of that wellness deficit that is being caused by a lack of lifestyle factors or preparedness by firefighters and EMTs. So these are just some examples of the body, the mind, and soul that you could work on. So for the body, you could do work on physical activity or nutrition. For the mind, you can do work on learning and motivation. And for the soul, maybe you're working on loving and forgiving others. And all of these things we can get better or worse at, or stronger or weaker. So these are just some examples. So when you consider the human dimension, you can see that on this slide there, the dimension goes from 0, hypothetically, to this theoretical limit of 100%. This spectrum comes from actually Aristotle, when he says that vice is either deficiency, which is not enough, or excess, which is too much. So this concept of virtue is where you land in the middle between deficiency and excess. And you're in that, what Aristotle calls the means between the extremes. And so if we were to apply that to us as humans, there is virtue ethics. What Aristotle talks about with finding the means between the extremes is this theoretical concept of virtue ethics, and that might include courage, for instance. Aristotle says that courage is the means between, on the one hand, deficiency, which would be cowardice, and on the other hand, excess, which would be foolhardiness, and courage is in the middle. And Aristotle says it actually leans slightly towards foolhardiness if you had to lean in one direction at all. But there's another way to apply the means between the extremes, which is this concept of a habitual limit. So, for example, if, let's talk about physical fitness, if your normal range is either sitting in a chair, which would get us very close to 0 activity or sort of completely deficient activity, and if your upper limit of your habitual, of your range, of your normal limit, your habitual limit is, let's say, a stiff walk, then that means your average or your means from that spectrum would be somewhere between sitting and a stiff walk. And when it comes to developing yourself as a human in physical fitness, the goal here would be to increase your habitual limit a little farther out, which is represented by that green dotted arrow to that green line that comes off of the blue line. And the idea here is that if you grow yourself just a little bit, then you actually end up moving your average or your mean closer to what would be the true mean between 0 and 100%. And it's not to say that you can just live your life in this imaginary 50% mark all the time. You certainly can't just run at 50% speed all day long. And so that's where the other side of this comes in. Sometimes you have to sleep, for instance, And sometimes you might be doing all out exertion like sprinting or, doing chest compressions or something like that. But if your habitual limit never really approaches that theoretical limit, or at least gets outside of some sort of sedentary range, then as time goes on, your mean, your average activity gets closer and closer to zero. And on this graph, you can see that injury is marked by a red dot. If you try to go too far out from your normal range too quickly, you will injure yourself. And that is true whether it's physical, mental, or spiritual, or again, if you want to call it social or whatever. You can think of injury with mental as, let's say, PTSD or some other disorder that comes from going too extreme in one direction for something too quickly. And for spiritual or social, you can think of injury as betrayal, maybe. Like maybe your loved one betrayed you. And that's sort of this sort of social or spiritual or psychological, emotional injury. But the reality is we can all grow our body, mind, and soul to the point where we can take on a more intense assault, if you will, and that can come with time. And so the goal here is to understand that who knows what the theoretical limit is to human ability, but certainly most of us could benefit from getting out of our normal range a little bit and trying to grow ourselves. And just to flip back to this last side, it could be any one of these things. And these aren't the only things that we can work on, but these are just some of the big ones that we could work on. So moving forward, we're going to talk about the what I call the big three fatalities and lifestyle. So what this graph is showing, if you see in the middle of the graph, it says physical activity, nutrition, and mental activity. And each one of these lines represents at least one research article. So this was, I used this this chart for my dissertation, and it was essentially born out of the research that I was doing. So I was trying to make sense of all this stuff that I felt like kept connecting to certain things. And as it turns out, whether you're talking about heart attack, cancer, or suicide, we find that we have these common sort of comorbidities, but then each one of these comorbidities can be linked back to a lifestyle factor. And oftentimes it's not just one, oftentimes it's more than one. And so the idea here is that it's not to take away from anything that's genetic. Certainly humans are made up of, this coding of our DNA, and part of who we are is something that either can't be changed or is extremely hard to change. And there's a great book for anyone interested by this world-renowned behavioral geneticist called, his name is Robert Plomin, and the book is called Blueprint. And in that book, he talks specifically about why genetics makes us who we are, how they make us who we are, and why those are so predictive of our future, because genetics does play a big role in who we are as individuals and the choices that we make or our abilities. But there's a lot on the table. In fact, many would argue that it's sort of 50-50, that you have this genetic side and then you have this sort of other side, which is environmental or nurture, or now there's actually a word for it in science called epigenetics, which is this concept that you can sort of change who you are little by little based on your choices in life. And that gets to the heart of this, which is the focus of my book, which I'm only looking at lifestyle, because there's so much literature that that seems to indicate that a lot of what especially is that firefighters and EMTs are facing are these problems that are caused by lifestyle factors, and especially things like obesity, hypertension, even diabetes. And as you can see on this chart, even obesity actually is now linked to cancer. If you hadn't heard about this, the CDC, I think it was in 2019, but don't quote me on that, actually ended up hard linking 13 cancers to obesity. And so from a resilience standpoint, if you want to be a more resilient human, being able to fight cancer would help us be more resilient, to help overcome challenges. And it seems that there is a direct correlation between the more weight you have, that's excess weight, I should say. Every body type is different. So some people are going to be shaped differently, and that's normal. You have your sort of your wide receiver types that are long and thin, you know, your linebacker types that are a little bit more, you know, big and burly. But what the science says, what the research on obesity says, is that the more weight you carry above your normal weight, the more risk you are at getting cancer, especially in these specifically they're GI cancers, but that's not the only ones. You know, from your neck to your groin area and everything in between, sort of esophagus, GI tract, you know, colon, things like that. Even breast cancer for women. So the point here, the takeaway is that, you know, if we're trying to prevent these big three fatalities, if you will, heart attack, cancer, and suicide, yes, there are genetic factors. Yes, there are job-related factors. You may get exposed to a major incident with all kinds of chemicals. But if we're not trying to make our body, minds, and souls stronger by working on our physical activity, nutrition, mental activity, or even you could say, you know, our connection to our friends, family, and that kind of stuff.
On the couch. Did you walk on the couch?
Brittany, did you have a question?
Walk on the couch.
Okay. If we're not working on those things, then it's going to be really hard, not only to convince the politicians that are funding our departments, but also just the general public, that when we do come down with something, and in, you know, of course, the tragic event that one of our brothers or sisters die of heart attack, cancer, suicide, you know, we would like to be able to say they were doing everything that they could to prevent that from a lifestyle factor, but sadly that's not the case right now across the board. And to highlight that, I want to show you this. This is actually from 2017, but the next slide has some updated statistics. You may have heard that, for instance, let's just talk about suicide for a second. Suicide is considered the 10th leading cause of death. It was before COVID. Now I think it got bumped down to 12. But a lot of times when we talk about leading causes of death, we're talking about all age groups. And so what I did here was, if you just look at what the age group that is closest to the fire service, and the closest you can get with national statistics is 15 to 64, what you end up seeing is that actually heart attack, cancer, and suicide are not just fire service problems. They're major problems in all working age groups from 15 to 64. And specifically, at least pre-COVID, suicide jumped from number 10 of all cause, when you include all ages, to number 4 when you just look at the age group that the average firefighter would be serving in uniform, or the average EMS provider would be serving in uniform during that time. And I say that because we have to be careful to say that the fire service or the EMS service is causing us to have heart attack, cancer, and suicide more than others. There's a lot of data that shows that the job is stressful, yes, but there's also a lot of data that show that these problems are not unique to the fire service. And in fact, they affect the general public at a very high level, and suicide is also very high level. The only thing that beat out suicide before COVID was unintentional injury as number 3. So after COVID, and these are updated numbers as of 21, the way it breaks down is cancer becomes number 1 in these age groups, heart disease number 2, unintended injury number 3, COVID number 4, and then suicide number 5. And as a side note, if anyone was following the way that we were doing COVID deaths, you know, there's definitely a lot of question there as to, the way we were tracking certain COVID deaths. I'm sure folks on this webcast right now can attest to the ideas that maybe they've even seen in the field where somebody dies, and you probably have heard these stories. Somebody dies of a gunshot wound or a car accident, and they're listed as a COVID death. Kind of, that type of stuff would be silly. So there is some question as to those COVID numbers. Who knows what the real numbers are? But even if that's the case, suicide still is very high for the age group of 15 to 64. Only being beaten out by unintentional injury and COVID-19. So if we look at what the nation is telling us to do, and again, this is fire service centric, but it essentially applies to the EMS service too, although some of these guiding documents may not be, the gold standard for EMS, but at least for fire departments that have a combination system of fire and EMS, it does apply. So you can see that the NFFF, the IAFF, IAFC, WFI, which is the International Association of Firefighters, International Association of Fire Chiefs, Wellness Fitness Initiative, and then the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. All three of those organizations, which are huge national organizations, say that fire services, including EMS services that are connected to fire services, should be doing education on health and wellness. And that's what all of these different numbers are documenting. These are I'm showing you where the sources of these guidelines are. We should educate on health and wellness. We should be having wellness programs in the fire service, and we should be doing research on this stuff. OSHA says that they have a blanket requirement for all employers that says employers are required to teach their employees what they should know in order to avoid illness, injury, and death. And in the fire service and EMS, we know that, at least on the fire side for sure, heart attack is actually the #1 cause of line of duty death. And cancer and suicide far outnumber the amount of line of duty heart attacks in the fire service. The NFPA puts out a fatality report every year, and they record the EMT deaths as well. I don't know if that's standalone EMS departments or EMS departments that are connected to the fire service, but in any case, they also have a high number of suicide. Now with OSHA, that regulation, that training requirement, there is actually an exception for the fire service, but from what I understand, every state book of codes, essentially in the United States, has adopted that verbiage for their state, and that state does not exempt the fire service. So even though OSHA's can't be directly applied to the fire service, the state law or state code normally does, and NFPA has adopted that same language in their guidelines in 1500 and 1583, which essentially address health and wellness and safety. Finally, I have on here NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They do line of duty death reports, and they continually say, based on death reports that are related to specifically heart attack on duty, that we should be having wellness programs within fire departments. And those programs would then exist to help grow resilience, at least in the physical aspect of human dimensions. But more and more, we're seeing guidance on mental health programs for fire and EMS services. So just an open question, what are you doing to prevent lifestyle-related health issues, whether that's at home or at work? So we're going to move on here to a behavior change model that's inspired by Aristotle. So it's not something that I made up. I sort of lent a design to it, but the philosophy comes from Aristotle, and I think it's useful for us to look at when we're asking ourselves, well, how do humans change? What is sort of an algorithm that we can look at and try to make ourselves more resilient. So what Aristotle says is that in order to know whether somebody is responsible for their action or not. And this is in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in his philosophy on moral responsibility. But we're just applying this to our responsibility. Essentially, it's the same concepts here. He says that the person, you'd have to assess whether the person knew the circumstances, whether they knew right from wrong, whether they had the intention to choose what they ended up choosing, and whether they had the ability to do otherwise. And so if you break that down, essentially knowledge of the circumstances is about whether you know what cannot be changed and what can change. Knowledge of right and wrong from Aristotle's philosophy is about whether you know on the topic that you're looking at what deficiency looks like and what excess looks like. That would give you the vicious side of the spectrum. Vice being deficiency or excess, virtue being that sort of golden mean, if you will, or the means between the extreme. And then the intent to choose also is about deficiency and excess, because you can know what is wrong, you can know what's deficient or excessive, and still not choose a virtuous path. And so Aristotle says you have to assess whether or not someone knew right from wrong, and also whether they intended to choose that action. And so you might be saying, well, what's the big deal there? What's the difference, G? The issue is that you can make an action, or make a choice sometimes, or may look like you're making a choice to do something or act in some way that's unintentional. And Aristotle essentially categorizes that in two ways. Something that's unintentional can be because you didn't really understand what you were doing, and so you made a decision based on not being fully aware of the act that you were doing. Or it can literally be like, let's say, a muscle twitch, or if somebody is having a seizure, that's also unintentional. If you're asleep or sleepwalking or half asleep, that's not doing the activity with intent. So that's the issue there. And it's important to distinguish whether or not, when we're assessing somebody's behavior, if they actually chose to do what they chose. And lastly, the sort of the check for all of this is whether or not the person had the ability to do otherwise. And what Aristotle says there is, sometimes people are making a choice, but it's under duress. So he actually says in his writings that he gives an example. For instance, if you're on a boat and there's a storm, sometimes you may have to just jettison things off the boat, and in order to save the ship and save the lives on the ship, get rid of the cargo, something like that. That's an example. That's an extreme example of a time where you're under duress to take action. Another example might be if somebody has a gun to your head and they say, you better do this. You don't really have a lot of choice in that situation. But more often, especially in the fire service and EMS services, when we're looking at the ability to do otherwise, you're looking at things like rules, policies, and there's a lot of literature now on culture and how that sort of shapes people's, behavior. And so I put here on the chart, it's an example that the organization should be, at least from OSHA law or NFPA guidance or your state law, should be educating on how to prevent illness, injury, and death. And if we're saying as a fire service and EMS service that, we're struggling with heart attack, cancer, and suicide, and that it's job related, then essentially the organization should be educating on how to prevent that. Because what the organization teaches to the individuals in their organization end up influencing, maybe to a small degree for some, maybe to a larger degree for others, but it can end up influencing their lifestyle choices. And that eventually feeds back into the organization. And it is a continuous sort of feedback loop. What the organization does to develop its members comes back to the organization. You'll remember from the beginning of the presentation that Aristotle said that we are what we repeatedly do. And that's true as humans. When we build habits, those habits make us who we are. But, and I chose to paraphrase a guy, a social psychologist, Albert Bandura. And I paraphrase him as saying, we do what we repeatedly see and hear. So essentially, you have on the one hand, individual responsibility, which is if you knew right from wrong, if you knew the circumstances, if you had the ability to do otherwise, then, you could tell somebody it's individual responsibility. You are what you repeatedly do. And that's why, you're dealing with what you're dealing with. On the other hand, as an organization, when you take members on, when you bring people into your organization, you are responsible for those members. That's the point of an organization, and having some sort of management and governance in your organization. And therefore, it's the organization's responsibility to provide that education. If the organization asks the individual, for instance, to wear PPE on a call, because we want to prevent AIDS and HIV and hepatitis and all these other things, right? But they don't teach you how to put the PPE on, and they don't provide the PPE for you, then the individual can say, I didn't have the ability to do otherwise because I wasn't given the PPE and I wasn't taught how to use it. So therefore, Aristotle would say the individual can't be fully held responsible in that action, because in some way they were being asked to do something and not given the tools to do it. They weren't given the education to do it. In the same way, if the organizations, fire service organizations, EMS organizations want firefighters to lower heart attack, cancer, and suicide either factors or deaths, then they should be educating on that. And further, for anyone who's interested, this is just sort of a side note, there is actually a benefit called the PSOB, the Public Safety Officers Benefit Act. And I think it's up to like $400,000 now if you die on duty, which includes heart attack and stroke. And this is any public safety officer. So you can be EMS, fire, police. There isn't anything in the PSOB, which is an act of Congress, by the way. And oh, by the way, if you end up, because you died on the line of duty, getting this for your family, it also pays for your family's education as well. They don't have provisions yet for cancer or suicide, but because so much of this stuff overlaps and is tied together, if you teach people how to prevent heart attack and stroke, you end up covering a lot of the same behaviors as that you can prevent, to some degree, suicide risk factors and cancer risk factors. So even if the only thing that was taught is following the PSOB guidelines, which is heart attack and stroke, you would still be covering a lot. Now, this model is simplified into this other image, essentially, which says, look, if we're looking at human behavior, first we have to understand what is the nature side, what is nurture. And that is, again, what you cannot change being nature, what you can change being nurture. We're going to focus on nurture because that's what we can change. And then from that area, we're going to go down into where does this behavior fall on the spectrum of deficiency and excess. So we need to make sure people understand that. Then we need to assess whether they're doing that. And then finally, it goes down to micro and macro, which is this understanding of where do we fall as individuals on the spectrum of things that are bigger than us, like our family, our community, our state, our nation, for instance. Those are macro influences, or micro influences. So for instance, we might know that we need to go, let's say, open the door for somebody who's knocking on the door, and but our knee gives out on the way. That might be a micro influence inside of us as humans, to where we're trying to do the right thing, but we can't. And that sort of circles all the way back to nature, which sometimes can be genetics or whatever. But the idea here is that when we're trying to address human behavior, we have to understand whether the person understands what is nature, what is nurture, focus on the nurture side of things for things that we can change, understand how to navigate the deficiency and excess, and then understand the influences and the forces that are being pushed on us. And once we account for all of that, then we can account for where that person's reality or an organization's reality as well. And you might be saying, gee, I'm never going to remember what you're showing me right now. That's cool. You got this little graph and it's about Aristotle and I don't really care. And this slide hopefully brings us home to what you're already doing as EMS providers or firefighters. You know, when you look at nature and nurture, essentially it's a scene size up, right? We're looking at what we can control. Yes, we're making note of the things that we cannot control, factors on the scene that are out of our control, but we're there to try to help and take care of what we can control. When we're looking at deficiency and excess, you know, call it mechanism of injury or nature of illness, you know, we're looking at severity essentially. So is something deficient? Is something in excess? And what can we do to bring this back to some sort of balance, or in the worst case scenario, just, you know, maintain until we can get them to an emergency room. And then lastly, the micro and macro concepts here can be relayed to consider support for additional resources. If you're a BLS unit, you get on scene and you realize you need to go up one step, then you're calling for support for ALS. Maybe you're getting the medical duty officer on scene. You know, in the worst case scenario, maybe we're bringing in some sort of, you know, hot team or some, you know, like a amputation team or whatever from Hopkins or something like that. So you already do this. I'm not trying to throw useless images at you, but the idea is if you can map this concept of human behavior change, if you can map that onto the schema that you already are familiar with, which is responding in EMS fashion, then perhaps you can start thinking in this way in life, because at the end of the day, resilience really if we're saying it requires you to overcome a challenge, oftentimes the only way to do that is to learn from somebody else or lean on somebody else, which means look for your support systems. And that might be family, community, and to some folks, if they're religious or, you know, spiritual, it might be God or something, you know, to that equivalent, if that's if you're spiritual but you don't believe necessarily in God or whatever. But it can go to that level of trying to find and lean on support to feel that that you are being supported. I see that there's something in the chat, Sean. Is that a question or a comment that we should address?
No, it's a comment that he really appreciates the draw-in or the connections that you're making, I think, at the end here.
Gotcha.
Number one, to kind of what providers do every day, and what you've been talking about.
Okay, great. So then when we take this concept and we apply it to what we've already talked about with resilience, the question then becomes, okay, we're looking at nature and nurture for which dimension, where do we want to focus on? Where do we want to build resilience? And essentially what that means is, where do we want to change, hopefully for the better, right? So we have to consider Aristotle's model with regard to which dimension of our human self we're going to focus on. And again, just to reiterate, we can grow each one of those dimensions. Now, it is true that at some point, as humans, we mature and then we decline and eventually we die. So even though the body can grow, there is a decline there. But even if you look at growth as a relative growth compared to the rate of decline you would have if you weren't doing some sort of effort, you know, we could get into this sort of semantics and the nuances and debate of this, but, you know, ask yourself, are you growing if, even though you're declining in general, you're making your body stronger and therefore slowing the decline? And a similar argument in physics is, if you're on a hill, but you're staying static on the hill because you're applying force to your wheels through your crankshaft, then how do you define that? You would have to say that there's positive force going into those wheels to keep you in a neutral position from not going down the hill. And it's similar to, as we decline in our physical age, we can still prevent or at least slow down that decline with efforts in our physical body. I mean, you can walk until you stop being able to walk. You know, that could be 80 years old, or some people run until they're 80. And that's the other thing too, is that even within our physical body, there are different ways, there are different S curves, if you will, that we can focus on. And the S curve is basically this concept that for everything we do in life, it starts off slow, then we have this immense growth, and then at the top, you know, growth becomes harder and harder until it sort of like stabilizes and it doesn't seem to grow very much at all anymore. So that S curve exists in many different ways in life. And it could be, for instance, from a physical standpoint, even as you age, maybe now you can, you know, fast for longer periods of time, or maybe you get into long distance running as opposed to sprinting, or maybe you can take better temperature extremes or whatever. So there's many different ways to cut that up and look at that. You know, going down to the next rung in whatever section of the human dimensions that you look at, you know, are you deficient or excessive, and do you know what a good balance is? You know, there are people who work out extreme every day, whether it's, you know, CrossFit or whatever, you know, bodybuilders, but when that stops, and you're no longer doing that heavy CrossFitting or bodybuilding, there is a decline again, and that's going to happen. And so the question isn't whether there's ever going to be a decline in something that you do. The question is whether you're keeping tabs on where you fall in the spectrum of deficiency and excess, and should you be going a little bit more in one direction or the other. Like we said, you have to sleep. So that's a period of time during the day where you're almost completely inactive. In fact, your METs go below a MET of 1. They go to like 0.9 when you're sleeping. But then when you're exercising at full speed, you know, you might be at like 20 METs or even higher. And so finding the middle ground doesn't always mean just staying at an invisible 50 percentile mark. It can mean you have to oscillate, but you have to keep tabs on that oscillation. And if that oscillation becomes too weak and all we're doing is going from sleep to sitting in a chair every day, then our middle ground becomes very close to being deficient all the time. And lastly, do you need support? Where are you going for support? It could be books, it could be family, friends, work, you know, like I said, religion, or even God at the highest extreme. And in the charts on the left here, you can see basically this applies to you as a human, whether you look at the cells, organs, system, and your own body, everything feeds into itself. It also applies to your organization. So the organization is going to become more resilient as humans in the organization become more resilient. You know, this word resilience has become such a buzzword, and we say we need to have resilient organizations, but the reality is, unless at least one individual becomes more resilient, whether it's for the team or for the whole organization, then by logic, by definition, the organization can't be more resilient if at least one person doesn't become more resilient. And in order for one person to become more resilient, we have to look at growing them in their body, their mind, or their soul. And there's many different ways to do that, as the chart on the right here shows, and these are the examples I used from earlier. But even within those examples, there's many different ways to change your physical activity, change your nutrition. You know, there's many different ways to learn, you know, to increase your motivation, to love, to forgive. But growth happens when we continuously build on that throughout our lives. And it may change, those things that we are addressing may change throughout our lives. But if we're not consistently addressing those things, then we're not becoming more resilient in those areas. And sadly, oftentimes where organizations focus all their energy and time and money on is just learning new policy. Hey, we changed from red shirts to blue shirts today, or we changed from this hose rack to that hose rack, or, you know, this IV setup to that IV setup. It's just policy statements or new rules or a new protocol. But is that really learning and growing your mind or your motivation? Or is there something else to that? And I would argue that when it comes to building human resilience, if all we are doing as an organization is focusing on new protocol or new techniques, then we're missing a lot of opportunity there to grow. And so resilience is not only important for the individual, and as we try to get stronger in our body and our mind, our soul, it goes down to the deepest levels of us, all the way down to our cells, all the way down to our DNA. And that's shown in the literature that the choices you make can affect you. And that's what the science of epigenetics is. And then those systems, those cells, those organs, those systems feed into us, and they make us either healthy or not healthy. And that's that cycle of wellness, which is the input, leading to health, which is the output. And that also exists in the organization. So we're at, I guess, 55 minutes here. I ended a little early, but we can open it up for discussion or Q&A, comments, whatever. I'm happy to stick around for, however long you guys want and we can go back over some slides too. And so I'm yours here, and just let me know when you're tired of me.
Gee, that was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean.
That Aristotle is one smart dude.
Yes, he is.
It reminds me a lot of like the just culture framework, right? That helps to differentiate between human error and system issues.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that assessment is still used in argumentation in the courts today. So.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think it's always hard. Well, it's such a complicated topic, right? I mean, definitely the organizations in which we work are definitely responsible for things that I would be kind of systematic disregard, right? Like, not providing us time to be able to take care of ourselves and to work out and not being part of the day, right? Not providing us time so we can, eat at a reasonable time or make sure that we eat. So I feel like that. And I think that those are all true. But as you so well pointed out, we have such personal responsibility too, right? And there's so many opportunities to grow, and it's not always easy, but it's so crazy important for us to take some personal responsibility.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, Sean, which is, each organization is different. In your organization as a physician, is it the organization's goal to focus on your development in your body, mind, and soul? Maybe not. But in the fire service and EMS services, there is a responsibility for organizations to care for at least the physical body for firefighters and EMS providers.
Sure.
And we can link that to law, which is the PSOB, right? We can say, if you die from a heart attack on duty, somebody is paying for that. If you as a physician die for a heart on duty with a heart attack, hopefully you have health insurance, right? But, or life insurance or whatever. But Johns Hopkins isn't going to say, and certainly the Congress hasn't enacted something that says, oh, that's our responsibility, right?
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it is different in the fire service and EMS services. There is a responsibility. So yeah, you do have to look at the purposes of the organization and what they expect of their individuals. So yes, it might change depending on the organization, but either way, whether it falls into organizational responsibility or not, if those dimensions of the human aren't growing, then a human won't become more resilient. They won't be able to overcome a challenge. And so there may be more or less responsibility for the individual in certain organizations. But either way, those areas have to be addressed.
Fair. What do you guys think? Any feedback for G? I am posting the sign-in link as well. I just posted that. Click on the link, put your information in, get your CEUs.
And again, if Sean, if anyone wants the PowerPoint to look at later, I'm happy to send it to you and you can share it.
Great. Thank you.
And I guess if no one else has any questions or comments, I'll make sure that I share with Sean at some point in the future when the book comes out. Again, I'm not making a dime off of it. Any of the sales of the book, any of the revenue goes to the NFFF. So we're trying to put our money where our mouth is and help prevent line of duty death and support those that are unfortunately still having that issue. So
that's awesome. When do you think the book is going to be published?
I was told summer or early fall this year.
Oh, great.
It's in review. I'm done with my part of it, except for any changes that they ask of me going forward. You know, as you may know, Bobby Halton, who was the sort of the editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering, died actually just before Christmas last year. And so not only for Fire, you know, Fire Engineering, that magazine company, Penwell, owned GEMS too.
Oh, interesting.
So so Bobby Halton was the head of that. He died just before Christmas, and so there's a lot of effort and energy going into sort of memorializing him. And I know they made like a special book for him to commemorate his life and all that. So yeah, I don't know how much of that is pushing anything else back in the projects, but yeah. So they said summer or early fall. We'll see. But I'll be sure to share it with you, Sean, when it comes out. Of course, I'm friends with Joanne Runn. She was my old boss at Howard County in the health and wellness. So she'll get a copy, and you know, if she wants to get it for the department, that'd be great. But you know, it'll be on her radar as well. So
Again, thank you so much.
yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. And if no one else has any last minute questions or comments, then I'll get out of your way.